Margaret Hawthorne had lived in the same cozy two-story brick house for almost 4 decades. Her life's chapters etched into every corner of it. The front porch, with its slightly creaking swing, had witnessed countless summers, endless cups of tea, and whispered conversations long into the night. At 65, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered storms most people couldn't even imagine. Her hair, silver and neatly tied into a bun, framed a face that bore both the softness of kindness and the sharp edges of resilience. Her eyes, calm and observant, had seen the world change around her, yet she remained anchored in her home, a fortress of memories and independence. For the past 10 years, Margaret had opened her doors to her daughter, Elizabeth, and son-in-law, Charles. After the untimely passing of Elizabeth's husband, Margaret's only son-in-law, the young couple had nowhere to go. Margaret, with her generous heart, insisted they move in. "This house is yours to live in, as long as you need," she had said, handing them the keys with a warm smile. She believed in family above all else and considered no act of kindness too small when it came to her daughter's happiness. Elizabeth and Charles had taken full advantage of Margaret's generosity. The couple had transformed the living room with expensive furniture, brought in state-of-the-art appliances, and redecorated rooms without consulting Margaret. At first, she had smiled and kept her concerns to herself. But over time, she began to notice subtle shifts in their behavior. They no longer spoke to her as an equal, no longer included her in decisions about the home. It was still her house, yet she felt a strange sense of displacement, as though her long-standing claim over her own space was gradually being erased. Despite these uneasy feelings, Margaret continued her daily routines with unwavering discipline. Every morning she would rise before dawn, brew her tea exactly the way she liked it, strong with a hint of honey, and sit on the front porch, watching the neighborhood awaken. The garden, which she tended herself, was her sanctuary. Roses, marigolds, and lavender bloomed under her careful hands, their colors bright and cheerful, a testament to decades of nurturing care. She had never been one to rush, never one to allow life's chaos to overtake her serenity. It was on a quiet Thursday morning, the sun just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the front yard, that the first signs of betrayal made themselves known. Margaret had just finished watering her rose bushes when she noticed Charles hurriedly closing the door of his car, looking around nervously. He appeared tense, unlike the relaxed demeanor he usually wore when Margaret was around. Something in his hurried movements sparked a faint alarm in her mind. Later that day, a formal letter arrived. The envelope, stark and official-looking, bore the emblem of a local law firm. Margaret's hands, though slightly aged, were steady as she slid it open. Inside was a series of documents. Legal forms that, if signed, would transfer the ownership of her house entirely to Charles. The handwriting of the attorney was precise, the legal jargon cold and unfeeling. It assumed that she would comply without question. But Margaret Hawthorne was not a woman who complied out of fear or inertia. Elizabeth, entering the room at that moment, noticed the letter in her mother's hands. "Mother, what is that?" she asked, curiosity laced with hesitation. Margaret, without letting her emotions betray her, responded with quiet firmness. "A letter from your husband's lawyer. Apparently, he thinks this house belongs to him now." Her voice was calm, but there was steel hidden beneath its gentle surface. Elizabeth, sensing the gravity of the situation, paled slightly. She had always relied on her mother's strength, but this was uncharted territory. Charles returned home that evening, smiling with practiced ease, unaware that Margaret had already read the letter. He approached her with what he thought was a winning charm. "Margaret, I got the papers delivered today. It's just a formality, you understand? Sign these, and everything will be settled. No worries." His tone was light, almost condescending, assuming she would be swayed by his casual manner. Margaret set the letter down and looked at him directly, her eyes locking onto his with a piercing clarity. "Charles," she said slowly, letting each word carry weight, "you may have lived here for 10 years, but this house has been mine for over 40. No formality, no lawyer, no trick will change that." The sharpness in her voice caught him off guard. He blinked, trying to gauge whether she was bluffing or serious. Seeing her resolve, Elizabeth stepped closer, whispering, "Mother, maybe we can talk about this?" But Margaret held up a hand, her decision unwavering. She knew that talk would not suffice. She needed evidence, proof, and the legal means to secure what was rightfully hers. Margaret began digging through her old files, the ones she had maintained meticulously over decades. Receipts, previous property documents, correspondences, everything was catalogued with care. She knew every loophole, every clause that could be exploited against her. Hours passed as she cross-referenced old records, gathering irrefutable proof of ownership. By nightfall, she had compiled a folder so thorough that even the most ambitious legal attempt against her would crumble. When the lawyer arrived the following morning, expecting a quick signature, he was met with a woman who had transformed overnight into a formidable adversary. Margaret presented her meticulously organized documents, each page a testament to her diligence and rightful claim. The lawyer's confident smile faltered as he leafed through the papers. Charles, standing behind him, felt the walls of his scheme closing in, panic replacing the arrogance that had carried him this far. Margaret's stance was unwavering. "You will not take what is mine. This house, my life's work, my sanctuary, belongs to me, and only me. Leave now, and never return without my permission." Her voice, though calm, echoed with the authority of someone who had fought too long and too hard to ever be overpowered. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Charles and the lawyer had left, defeated and humiliated. Margaret locked the doors with her own hands, securing the house in a way that left no room for contestation. As the evening approached, she returned to her front porch, the swing creaking softly beneath her as she poured herself a cup of tea. The aroma of chamomile and honey filled the air, mingling with the scent of her garden, a fragrant celebration of victory. She sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through her, and allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. The house was hers, as it had always been, and she had proven that no amount of deception could take it from her. Leaning back, she murmured to herself with a mix of triumph and contentment, "Apna liya hua hak jishi keo nahi dedi." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Margaret sat there, undisturbed, a woman who had reclaimed her home, her dignity, and her peace. The house, her life story, stood tall and unyielding, a testament to resilience and the quiet power of standing one's ground. The morning after Margaret had secured her house, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. The gentle hum of distant lawnmowers and the chirping of birds did little to disturb the sense of calm Margaret had restored. Yet inside, the tension between her and Charles was far from over. Charles had returned home late that night, slamming the door behind him, muttering under his breath. He was furious, not just at his failed attempt to seize the house, but at the unexpected fortitude of the woman he had underestimated. Elizabeth, torn between loyalty to her mother and empathy for her husband, found herself caught in an emotional tug-of-war. "Charles," she said gently one morning over breakfast, "I know you're upset, but Mother isn't wrong. This is her home." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her internal conflict. Charles, with a scowl on his face, slammed his fork down. "Upset? I'm beyond upset. Elizabeth. I've been generous, and she treats it like some fortress she's holed up in. She's gone too far." Margaret, overhearing the conversation from the kitchen doorway, didn't intervene immediately. She had learned long ago that confrontation worked best when calm strategy met impulsive aggression. Charles's anger was predictable. It had always been his primary reaction when things didn't go his way. Margaret simply returned to tending her garden, pruning the rose bushes with precision, each snip a silent reminder that she remained in control. Yet Charles wasn't one to give up easily. Over the next few days, he began whispering to a few neighbors, subtly insinuating that Margaret was unfair, perhaps even unstable. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Isolate, intimidate, and paint the target as unreasonable. Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed the wary glances, the subtle shift in social dynamics. She also noticed Elizabeth's discomfort. Her daughter was struggling to maintain balance between the loyalty to her mother and her husband's mounting frustrations. Margaret decided it was time to reinforce her position further. She contacted an old friend, Jonathan Pritchard, a retired attorney who had handled property disputes for decades. Jonathan arrived within hours, a man in his late 60s with a sharp eye and an unwavering sense of justice. "Margaret, you've done well," he said, inspecting the document she had meticulously prepared. "But he won't stop trying. People like Charles don't accept defeat easily." Margaret nodded, sipping her tea. "I know. That's why I need to be proactive. He'll test boundaries. He'll try another way. I want us ready." Jonathan smiled approvingly. "You've always been thorough, Margaret. That's your strength. Now, let's make sure the next steps are foolproof." Meanwhile, Charles grew restless. Feeling humiliated by his failed attempt, he began devising more elaborate plans. First, he tried to appeal to Elizabeth, attempting to persuade her that Margaret's actions were excessive. "Elizabeth, think about it," he urged one evening. "We've lived here for 10 years. I've invested in renovations. Isn't it fair we have some say?" Mother's reaction: "It's extreme." Elizabeth shook her head, a mix of frustration and sorrow in her eyes. "Charles, fairness isn't just about investment or time. Mother built this life. We've been living here as guests, not owners. You need to accept that." Frustrated and desperate, Charles took a bolder step. He began searching for any loophole in the paperwork, any minor technicality he could exploit to claim ownership. He spent hours poring over public records, contacting law firms, and making calls to real estate offices. Yet every effort met the same result. Margaret's legal standing was unassailable. Every document, every receipt, every previous transaction confirmed that the house had always been hers. As the tension escalated, Margaret remained unshaken. She turned her attention to fortifying not just the legal side but also the home's practical defenses. She installed security cameras, ensured all locks were modern and impenetrable, and even trained herself in basic self-defense, just in case Charles or anyone else tried to overstep boundaries. Her demeanor became more commanding, her presence in the house undeniable. One evening, as Margaret sat on the front porch enjoying her tea, she noticed Charles pacing back and forth across the driveway. His movements were tense, calculated, almost desperate. Elizabeth watched silently from the doorway, torn between urging peace and supporting her mother. Margaret, sensing the storm brewing in her household, decided it was time to confront the issue head-on, but in her own way, strategically, decisively, without losing control of her emotions. The following morning, she called Charles into the study. "Charles," she said, her voice calm yet authoritative, "I want to make this perfectly clear. This house is mine. It always has been and it always will be. Your attempts to manipulate or intimidate me will fail. You have one choice: respect the boundaries or leave." Her eyes were steady, unwavering, radiating a quiet power that Charles had not anticipated. He laughed nervously, trying to mask his unease. "Margaret, this isn't the way family works. Surely we can negotiate, reach a compromise." Margaret shook her head. "There is no compromise when it comes to rightful ownership. Respect isn't negotiable. This house, these grounds, these memories, they are mine. Your investment doesn't grant you entitlement." Charles stormed out, slamming the door behind him. But this time, Margaret didn't just rely on her existing evidence. She began creating a more comprehensive archive: photographs of the house across decades, letters from neighbors, old utility bills, receipts for renovations and repairs, all meticulously labeled and dated. Every single detail built an unbreakable narrative of her ownership and dedication. Elizabeth, watching her mother's determination, began to realize the depth of Margaret's resilience. She had always known her mother was strong, but witnessing her fight, document, and strategize with such precision inspired both awe and reflection. Elizabeth began to stand more firmly with Margaret, understanding that sometimes love meant supporting the harder path, even if it was painful in personal relationships. As days turned into weeks, the tension reached a subtle stalemate. Charles continued to plot, but each step he took was met with Margaret's preparation. The house, once a sanctuary of simple domesticity, had become a strategic battleground. Yet through it all, Margaret maintained her routine, tending her garden, sipping tea on the porch, and asserting her quiet authority. She had learned that true power was not in anger or shouting, but in preparation, knowledge, and an unshakable belief in one's own rights. Margaret had hardly slept that night. Even though her house was secure and her legal position unassailable, she knew Charles would not stop. Men like him thrived on confrontation, on finding loopholes, on testing limits. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his tone when he stormed out of the study the previous morning. This was far from over. By the next afternoon, Charles returned, not alone this time. He had a new ally, his distant cousin, Victor, a sharp-tongued businessman known for bending rules when convenient. "He thinks he can outsmart me?" Charles muttered under his breath as Victor arrived, carrying a stack of folders. "Margaret has no idea what's coming." Victor was smooth, strategic, the kind of person who thrived in legal gray areas. Together, Charles and Victor began devising a plan that relied on intimidation, persuasion, and subtle deceit. They intended to overwhelm Margaret with paperwork, legal jargon, and veiled threats. Their strategy was simple. Create chaos, make her doubt herself, and force her to relinquish control voluntarily. Meanwhile, Margaret sensed something had changed. There was an intensity in Charles's steps, a calculated sharpness she had never seen before. Elizabeth, noticing the tension, came to Margaret that afternoon while she was watering her rose garden. "Mother," she whispered, "Charles isn't acting alone anymore. He's brought someone else. I think he's planning something serious." Margaret nodded without stopping her work. "Let them come. I have anticipated this." She didn't reveal all her preparations. She never did. A part of her strength came from the calm confidence that only comes when one has already thought several steps ahead. She had already made copies of all critical documents, reinforced security cameras, and even secretly contacted a few local law enforcement officers who knew the family history. Just in case. True to Margaret's instincts, the next day Charles and Victor arrived at the house, their faces composed but eyes sharp. "Good morning, Margaret," Victor said smoothly, carrying a thick file. "We thought it would be best to review some documents together. There are a few discrepancies that need clarification." Margaret, sipping her tea on the front porch, looked up slowly, a smile playing on her lips. "Discrepancies?" she asked lightly. "Do you mean the kind that exist only in imagination?" Victor shifted slightly, trying to maintain composure. "We simply want to ensure everything is accurate. It's only a precaution." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but her smile never faltered. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen, but my records are precise, meticulously organized, and verifiable. If you believe otherwise, I suggest you take a seat and examine them calmly." She gestured toward the living room, but remained standing on the porch, a subtle display of authority. Hours passed as they pored over documents, scrutinized old letters, and attempted to find even a hint of a weakness. Every time Victor thought he had discovered a minor issue, Margaret countered with evidence, context, or a dated receipt that invalidated his claim. Charles grew increasingly frustrated, his impatience palpable. He whispered angrily to Victor, but Margaret caught the conversation with a smile. "You know," she said softly, almost conversationally, "frustration is understandable when expectations do not meet reality. But facts are stubborn things. They cannot be negotiated or intimidated." By late afternoon, Victor realized that their strategy was failing. Charles's anger had reached a dangerous peak, and yet Margaret's calm, calculated responses made it impossible for him to act impulsively without looking foolish. Margaret had anticipated this exact scenario. She had even prepared a quiet recording device to document their behavior, proof of intimidation attempts should it come to court. Elizabeth, observing from the hallway, felt a surge of admiration for her mother. She had always known Margaret was clever, but witnessing the way she handled two aggressive, scheming men simultaneously left her in awe. Margaret's strategy was not only about legal defense, it was psychological. She controlled the space, the conversation, and ultimately the outcome. That evening, when Charles and Victor finally left, defeated but unwilling to admit it, Margaret returned to her rose garden. She placed her hands gently on the blooms, inhaling their scent. "You can try every trick," she murmured to herself, "but some things, some rights, cannot be taken by force." Yet Margaret knew this was far from the end. Charles's pride would not allow him to back down completely. He would return with a new plan, a new scheme, perhaps more desperate, more cunning. Margaret had learned over her life that battles are rarely won in a single move. They require foresight, patience, and sometimes, the quiet endurance of the patient. That night, as she sipped her evening tea on the porch, Elizabeth joined her. "Mother, how do you do it? How do you remain so calm?" Margaret smiled softly. "Calm comes from preparation, Elizabeth. Strength comes from knowledge. And courage. Courage comes from knowing that what is rightfully yours cannot be stolen if you stand firmly." Elizabeth hugged her mother, sensing both the weight of the ongoing struggle and the unshakable foundation Margaret had built. Outside, the stars shimmered over the Hawthorne estate, indifferent to human conflict, yet the house itself seemed to hum with Margaret's quiet, resolute power. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual in the neighborhood. Charles woke up with a sense of urgency gnawing at him, the previous day's failure still fresh in his mind. He paced back and forth in his study, muttering to himself. I need a plan they can't anticipate. Something clever, subtle, undeniable. Victor entered shortly after. His expression clouded with concern. We can't keep pushing head-on, Charles. She's too prepared, too deliberate. Every move we make, she counters. Charles stopped pacing and leaned against the window frame, staring at the garden below where Margaret and Elizabeth were tending the rose bushes. There has to be a way. She's just one old woman. How can she hold this much power? Victor shook his head. Age has nothing to do with it. She knows the law, she knows the papers, and she knows people. Every step we take, she's 10 steps ahead. Meanwhile, inside the house, Margaret quietly planned her day. She moved from room to room, checking that every bill was paid, every letter accounted for, every document filed correctly. Her movements were smooth, precise, yet there was an energy about her, an unspoken confidence that Elizabeth admired silently. Elizabeth, curious and concerned for her mother, finally asked, "Mother, what if they don't stop? What if Charles tries something extreme?" Margaret paused, brushing her hands off on a towel. "Then we deal with it. Every time they think they've found an advantage, we respond. But we do it calmly, legally, and with certainty. Anger has no place in control." Just as she finished speaking, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth peeked through the window and saw a man she didn't recognize, holding a clipboard and a stack of papers. "Who could that be?" she whispered. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Let's find out." The man introduced himself as a process server delivering legal notices. Margaret took the documents and glanced over them briefly. A small smile tugged at her lips. "They're trying again," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Elizabeth frowned. "They never stop, do they?" Margaret shook her head. "Ambition blinded by greed never does. But we have what they don't, preparation and truth." Later that afternoon, Charles and Victor met privately at Victor's office, papers scattered across the desk. "We need a new approach," Charles said, rubbing his temples. "Margaret is too methodical. If we push like this, we'll just exhaust ourselves." Victor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I might have an idea, but it's risky. It involves stirring neighbors' opinions, maybe creating doubt in Margaret's credibility." Charles's eyes lit up. "Go on." Victor smirked. "We plant stories, subtle whispers. Question her age, her memory, her judgment. If the neighbors start doubting her, it weakens her position indirectly. Legally, we may still be blocked, but psychologically, she could be shaken." Charles nodded eagerly. "Do it. Begin immediately. I want everyone thinking she's not as strong as she seems." Back at the house, Margaret noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood over the next few days. Neighbors began asking her about small mistakes she supposedly made, questioning minor details of her past dealings. She heard the whispers but remained unshaken. Elizabeth watched her mother handle each interaction with grace. "Mother, they're trying to make you doubt yourself," she said. Margaret smiled gently, adjusting Elizabeth's scarf. "Doubt is a tool, child. Used wisely, it teaches you to stand firmer. They cannot touch what is firmly held." One afternoon, Charles decided to escalate further. He showed up unannounced at the house, claiming he had urgent concerns about the property and demanded Margaret meet with a mediator. Margaret met him at the door, her calm composure like a shield. "Charles, if you have legal matters to discuss, they can be addressed properly through formal channels. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." Charles's frustration bubbled over. "You can't just ignore me. This is our home too." Margaret's eyes locked onto his. "This is my home. And every legal step I've taken confirms it. Your interpretation does not change facts." He stumbled over his words, anger overtaking rational thought. You're impossible. How can you be so prepared?" Margaret finished for him, her voice steady. "Yes. That is exactly why I am not moved by threats or attempts at coercion." Victor, waiting outside, whispered, "She's frighteningly calm. How does she do it?" Charles said nothing, staring at the floor, realizing that no amount of yelling or manipulation would break Margaret's resolve. By evening, Margaret and Elizabeth sat together on the porch again. The sun cast long shadows over the garden, but Margaret's presence made the house feel luminous, safe. Elizabeth leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. Do you ever get tired, Mother? Margaret shook her head softly. No, child. Standing firm doesn't tire you if your ground is true. You only tire if your cause is false or weak. As darkness fell, the house was filled with a quiet dignity, a sense that despite all the schemes and plots, Margaret remained the unwavering center. The roses, slightly bent from the day's wind, seemed to straighten under her watchful eyes, as though the garden itself mirrored her resilience. Across the street, Charles sat in his car, watching the house. He clenched his hands on the steering wheel. We need something more. Something that will shake her completely. Victor leaned back in the passenger seat. I'm not sure anything will. She's beyond ordinary measures now. But we'll keep trying. People like Margaret. They can be beaten only by the improbable. Inside the house, Margaret finished her tea and looked toward the darkened sky. The improbable never frightens me, she whispered to herself. I only fear dishonesty and weakness. The house settled into night, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. But in the shadows of that quiet evening, the tension between those determined to take and those determined to protect remained unresolved, each side preparing silently for the next move in a battle of wills that was far from over. The following week, Margaret woke early, as was her habit. The first rays of sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the polished wooden floors. Elizabeth was already up, quietly making breakfast, careful not to disturb her mother's contemplative mood. Mother, do you think Charles will try something new today? Elizabeth asked, her voice hushed but tinged with worry. Margaret sipped her tea, looking out the window at the garden. He will. He always does. But remember, Elizabeth, determination without knowledge is chaos. We have preparation. They have impatience. Their quiet morning was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Margaret straightened, her posture commanding despite her age. Elizabeth peeked nervously through the curtains and saw a well-dressed man holding a briefcase. Another lawyer? Elizabeth asked, glancing at her mother. Margaret nodded. Or a messenger of trouble. Let's find out. The man introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, representing a financial consultancy claiming to have urgent matters regarding the property taxes and insurance. Margaret invited him inside, her expression calm but alert. Please have a seat, she said, gesturing toward the parlor. I assume these matters can be discussed reasonably? Mr. Harrington smiled thinly. Certainly, Mrs. Whitmore. We just need to review some documents and signatures to ensure there are no discrepancies. It's a standard precaution. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I am always cautious with my signatures. Please proceed. As Harrington went through the papers, Margaret noticed subtle discrepancies, tiny attempts to manipulate dates and numbers. Her hands remained steady, but her mind raced. This is incorrect, she said softly, pointing to a section. This date has been altered, and this document is not authentic. Do you have the original? Harrington hesitated, his carefully practiced calm faltering. I will need to verify with my office. Margaret leaned back, watching him carefully. Verification is wise. It is the same advice I offer to anyone attempting to bypass truth. Elizabeth, standing quietly nearby, whispered, Mother, they're trying to trick you again. Margaret nodded. Indeed. But truth is like water. It flows and finds its level. Lies can never hold it back for long. Later that afternoon, Charles and Victor convened once more in a hidden corner of the city at a small cafe. Their conversation was tense. We're running out of options, Victor admitted. Every legal maneuver is countered. Every attempt at subtle manipulation is noticed and corrected. She seems untouchable. Charles slammed his hand on the table. Untouchable. I can't believe an old woman. Not old, Charles, Victor interrupted. Prepared. Experienced. Smart. She is not ordinary. That is the real problem. Charles rubbed his face, exasperated. We need something drastic, something that forces her out. If we can't undermine her legally, we might have to scare her. Victor frowned. I've seen that approach fail. Fear only strengthens someone who is certain of themselves. You remember last time, how calm she was when we tried threats. You saw her strength. Charles clenched his fists. Then we find her weakness. There has to be one. Meanwhile, back at the house, Margaret and Elizabeth spent the afternoon reviewing old property documents and receipts. Margaret explained each detail to Elizabeth, teaching her not only the technicalities but also the importance of awareness. Knowledge, Margaret said, is a shield. The more you understand, the harder it is for others to manipulate you. Always question, always verify. Never rely on appearances alone. Elizabeth listened intently, absorbing her mother's wisdom. Mother, what if they never stop? Margaret smiled faintly. Then we endure. And every day we become stronger. Resistance is a habit, child. Once you cultivate it, it becomes second nature. That evening, the tranquility of the house was briefly shattered by the ringing of the telephone. Margaret answered calmly, listening to a distorted voice threatening legal action if she didn't comply with demands for property transfer. She hung up and turned to Elizabeth. They are growing desperate. Desperation is louder than reason, but easier to counter if you remain composed. Elizabeth bit her lip. I wish it were easier. Watching them scheme feels exhausting. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. Exhaustion comes from resisting poorly, not from resisting wisely. We do not tire if we hold steady in truth. Late that night, Charles met with a group of his associates in a dimly lit office. Maps, charts, and lists of Margaret's daily routines covered the table. She is predictable in her routines, Charles said, pointing to a chart showing her morning tea times and her daily visits to the garden. If we can create a situation that disrupts her, even slightly, we can exploit it. Victor studied the map. A slight disruption won't work. She adapts instantly. You've seen it. The man with the documents yesterday. She caught the discrepancy immediately. Any disruption we create will be recognized and corrected before it escalates. Charles leaned back, frustrated. Then we must escalate further. Pressure from multiple directions. Neighbors, officials, even media if necessary. A combined assault might break her. Victor shook his head. Or it might backfire completely. She has a way of turning attacks into demonstrations of strength. Remember the porch incident? Yes, Charles admitted reluctantly. I remember. And that is exactly what terrifies me. She makes our failures look small while appearing invincible. In the quiet of the night, Margaret sat on her porch, sipping tea, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights. The day's minor disturbances had passed, and the house felt safe once again. She breathed in the cool night air, feeling a sense of peace despite the chaos around her. Elizabeth joined her, carrying a small blanket. Do you ever feel lonely, Mother? She asked softly. Margaret shook her head. Loneliness is different from solitude. Solitude can be empowering, a space to think, reflect, and plan. Loneliness is an absence. I have my truth, my home, and you. That is enough. As they sat together, the tension outside seemed to linger but not penetrate the walls of the home. Charles and Victor were plotting, whispering, scheming. But inside, Margaret and Elizabeth were building strength with knowledge, patience, and courage. Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. Remember this, Elizabeth. The greatest power is not in striking first, but in being ready, knowing, and remaining unshaken. That is how a home is truly defended. And so the night passed. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet battles being fought on a small street in a modest home. But within those walls, resilience was growing, and the stage was set for conflicts yet to come. Conflicts that would test every ounce of strategy, courage, and wisdom Margaret possessed. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the familiar sounds of birds in the garden and the faint hum of city traffic in the distance. Elizabeth was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and brewed tea filled the house, creating an air of normalcy that Margaret cherished fiercely. Mother, Elizabeth began cautiously, should we expect another visit today? Margaret's eyes sparkled with a mix of amusement and determination. I would be surprised if they rested. Impatience is their constant companion. But they underestimate patience and preparation. Just as she finished her sentence, a knock echoed through the house. Margaret didn't flinch. She moved calmly to the door and opened it, revealing a young woman in a crisp business suit holding a clipboard. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, the woman said, smiling politely. I am Miss Fletcher from the municipal office. We're conducting a routine property assessment. Would you mind if I come inside to verify some details? Margaret studied her carefully, noting the subtle nervousness beneath the professional exterior. Of course, come in. Please, follow me to the parlor. As they walked, Margaret's mind raced. This was routine, yes, but nothing in recent weeks had been truly routine. Every visitor had been a potential threat, a disguised attempt to manipulate or intimidate her. In the parlor, Margaret motioned for Elizabeth to sit with them. Please, have a seat, Ms. Fletcher. Let's review whatever needs reviewing. Fletcher spread out several forms and documents across the table. We just need to ensure that all property records are accurate. It's a standard procedure to prevent future discrepancies. I'll need your signature on these acknowledgement forms. Margaret's eyes scanned each page carefully, noting even the tiniest anomalies. There were slight misalignments in dates, minor changes in formatting, and some inconsistencies in official seals. Her fingers tapped the table lightly as she spoke. Ms. Fletcher, are these forms verified against the original municipal records? Because I see a few irregularities that need clarification. Fletcher hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. I believe they are standard copies. Originals are kept at the office. Margaret leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. I would prefer to verify originals before signing anything. Accuracy is crucial. After all, errors can create unintended consequences. Elizabeth watched her mother, pride swelling in her chest. Margaret's calm assertiveness had a way of diffusing tension while asserting control. Fletcher nodded nervously, clearly realizing she couldn't pressure Margaret. Meanwhile, across town, Charles paced his office like a caged tiger. His frustration was palpable, his impatience gnawing at him. We've tried legal pressure, intimidation, and manipulation, he muttered to Victor, who sat quietly, observing. Nothing works. She counters every attempt with facts, evidence, and... He threw his hands up. This unyielding confidence. Victor spoke calmly. You see, Charles, it's not just intelligence. It's her ability to anticipate moves, to stay calm under pressure, and to empower those around her. We're not just facing a legal obstacle. We're facing a force of nature. Charles slammed his fist onto the table again. Then we escalate further. We can't stop now. If she won't yield to law, we'll have to find another method. One that forces her hand. Victor frowned. Charles, be careful. Every escalation you attempt seems to strengthen her position rather than weaken it. Have you considered the possibility that any overt act will backfire spectacularly? Charles shook his head. No. Victor. We have to try. There has to be a way to exploit a flaw. Everyone has one. Back at the Whitmore residence, Margaret spent the afternoon sorting through old receipts, letters, and property documents. Each piece of paper was carefully catalogued and cross-verified. Elizabeth assisted, asking questions and learning from her mother's meticulous methods. Mother, Elizabeth asked, how do you know which details matter and which don't? Margaret smiled softly. Experience. Elizabeth. And patience. The smallest detail can unravel the biggest deception. Never dismiss anything as insignificant. What seems minor today may become crucial tomorrow. Later, as dusk approached, Margaret and Elizabeth sat together in the garden, sipping tea and listening to the quiet rustle of leaves. The tension from the day's events seemed to fade, replaced by the comforting rhythm of routine. Mother, do you ever fear they might succeed? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at her daughter, eyes steady and unwavering. Fear is a luxury for those without preparation. We do not act out of fear. We act with knowledge, clarity, and persistence. That is our advantage. That is how we protect what is ours. That evening, Charles and Victor met with a new ally, a man known for his persuasive influence over public opinion. They plotted strategies to create doubt in the neighborhood, hoping whispers and rumors might shake Margaret's resolve. This has to be subtle, Charles instructed. If she senses overt aggression, she will counter it. We need a gentle tide of uncertainty, small enough to go unnoticed but powerful enough to sow doubt. Victor nodded. We can plant suggestions, anonymous letters, and hints of irregularities in public records. But remember, even this must be precise. One mistake and she will turn it into proof of their incompetence. Meanwhile, Margaret, ever vigilant, had anticipated such tactics. She had already begun documenting everything meticulously, preparing evidence to counter even the most subtle manipulations. "Elizabeth," she said that night, "always remember, the world is full of those who will attempt to take what is not theirs. But the combination of knowledge, patience, and unwavering principle creates an invisible shield. Others may try to pierce it, but it bends and absorbs the blows." Elizabeth nodded, absorbing her mother's wisdom like a sponge. She understood, even at this young age, that their battle was not just legal or financial. It was a battle of wits, patience, and character. As night fell over the Whitmore residence, the quiet hum of the city outside contrasted sharply with the storm of schemes being brewed elsewhere. Margaret's home remained a sanctuary, a fortress of calm, preparation, and unwavering resolve. Little did Charles know, every plan he and his allies devised was being anticipated, countered, and meticulously documented by Margaret. Every whisper of doubt, every attempt at subtle intimidation, only strengthened her position. And so, the stage was set for the next wave of conflict. Margaret, armed with knowledge and courage, waited patiently, confident that truth and preparedness were mightier than any scheme her adversaries could conjure. The night passed with quiet determination, and as dawn approached, Margaret prepared herself for what would come next. She knew that the game was far from over, and that every day brought both challenges and opportunities to demonstrate the strength of a woman who had taken control of her destiny. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Whitmore residence, casting a warm glow over the meticulously arranged furniture. Margaret sat at the dining table, a stack of documents before her, a cup of tea steaming gently at her side. Elizabeth was beside her, notebook in hand, eager to absorb every lesson her mother was willing to share. Margaret had spent the previous night reviewing property records, correspondence, and neighborhood reports. She had anticipated Charles and Victor's subtle schemes and had already begun preparing countermeasures. Her calm demeanor was deceptive. Behind her serene smile, a mind worked tirelessly, anticipating every possible move. Elizabeth looked up from her notes. "Mother, why do you think they keep trying? They must see that every plan they make fails." Margaret's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "Elizabeth, not everyone understands the value of persistence and deception. Some people mistake aggression for power. They believe sheer will can achieve what knowledge and patience cannot. That is their greatest flaw." Just then, the mail arrived. Margaret took the letters slowly, one by one, and her brow slightly furrowed. Most were ordinary, but a few were unusual. Unsigned notes with vague warnings, and a letter with the city seal, suggesting discrepancies in municipal records. She carefully examined the letter. The writing was formal, yet vague, implying potential legal trouble if certain issues were not addressed promptly. Margaret held the envelope up to the light, inspecting the seal and the paper quality. It was authentic enough to appear legitimate to an unsuspecting person, but she recognized the subtle irregularities immediately. "This is an attempt at intimidation," she said calmly. "They are hoping the appearance of official pressure will make us act hastily. But we will not be rushed. Elizabeth. Every action must be deliberate, every step verified." Elizabeth nodded, admiration in her eyes. "What should we do?" Margaret smiled. "We respond the way we always do. Carefully, thoroughly, and with proof. We will document everything. Evidence will be our shield." Meanwhile, Charles sat in his office, frustration etched into every line of his face. "Victor, they're not faltering. Every letter, every suggestion, every plan. She anticipates them all. It's infuriating." Victor leaned back, thoughtful. "Charles, perhaps it is time to shift tactics. Subtlety is no longer sufficient. She's fortified, aware, and prepared. The only way to break someone like Margaret Whitmore is to confront them directly. But even then, we must tread carefully. One misstep and she will turn it against us." Charles slammed his fist on the desk. "Direct confrontation? That is what I've been preparing for. If subtlety fails, we escalate. We need pressure on all fronts. Influence the neighbors, question her credibility publicly, hint at hidden debts or obligations. She cannot resist everything at once." Victor frowned. "It may not be enough, Charles. She is meticulous and resilient. Your pressure campaigns might only reinforce her position, making her appear stronger to everyone around her." Back at the Whitmore residence, Margaret continued her careful planning. She reached out to the municipal office herself, requesting verification of records, personally ensuring that nothing could be used against her. Each letter she received, each conversation she had, was documented and stored. Margaret knew that foresight and patience were her strongest weapons. As the day progressed, Margaret noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. A few neighbors had begun whispering about alleged property disputes, likely influenced by Charles's indirect tactics. She observed discreetly, noting who said what, timing her responses carefully. In the evening, Elizabeth asked, "Mother, do you ever worry they might win somehow?" Margaret took a deep breath and looked out at the garden, where the last rays of sunlight reflected off the neatly trimmed hedges. "Elizabeth, worry is useless. Preparation and vigilance are what matter. They may try to win, but I do not fear. Every action they take only strengthens my resolve and provides further evidence of their intentions." Meanwhile, Charles and Victor had recruited another ally, a charismatic lawyer with a reputation for bending situations in favor of powerful clients. They believed that with his involvement, they could pressure Margaret into concessions. "Once we have legal representation on our side, we can overwhelm her with documents, deadlines, and official notices," Charles explained. "Even a strong person may buckle under that kind of bureaucratic assault." Victor nodded, though uneasily. "Yes, but Margaret has already shown exceptional skill at scrutinizing documents. Any attempt to mislead her may backfire, and if she finds a flaw in our evidence, it could ruin our position entirely." The next morning, the lawyer arrived at the Whitmore residence. He was polished, confident, and well-practiced in his demeanor. Margaret greeted him with polite hospitality, offering tea and seating him in the parlor. "I understand you represent Mr. Whitmore?" Margaret asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," the lawyer replied smoothly. "I've been asked to clarify some points regarding property ownership and ensure all documentation is in order." Margaret gestured toward the table. "By all means. Please, let us review every document thoroughly. I would appreciate clarity and accuracy above all." As the lawyer began presenting forms and legal jargon, Margaret listened carefully, her eyes scanning every page. She caught discrepancies almost immediately. Dates that didn't match, stamps that were slightly off-center, references to laws that were misquoted. Each error, no matter how minor, was noted meticulously. Elizabeth watched, silently impressed. "Mother, you see everything." Margaret smiled faintly. "Not everything, but enough. The smallest inconsistency can be critical." By the end of the meeting, the lawyer realized that any attempt to pressure Margaret would be futile. She countered every claim with evidence, remained composed, and presented her findings with clarity. It was a masterclass in control and preparation. As the lawyer left, Margaret turned to Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, remember this. People may try to confuse, intimidate, or overwhelm you. Never let haste or fear dictate your actions. Evidence, patience, and calm resolve are far stronger than anger or aggression." Elizabeth nodded, committing every word to memory. She understood now that their battle was not just about property. It was a testament to strength, intelligence, and unwavering principle. That night, as the stars appeared over the Whitmore residence, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. The first wave of the latest attempt had failed. Charles and his allies were frustrated, their schemes unraveling under her careful scrutiny. Yet Margaret knew this was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tactics, and new attempts to test her resolve. But she was ready. She had prepared, anticipated, and strengthened every defense. No subtle trick, no clever manipulation, could pierce the armor she had built through experience, patience, and wisdom. And so, Margaret Whitmore remained unshaken, a beacon of resilience and intelligence, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. The morning air carried a crisp chill as Margaret stepped onto the front porch, sipping her tea and surveying the quiet street. The Whitmore residence had never looked more serene. Yet Margaret knew tranquility was deceptive. The past weeks had proven that Charles and Victor were relentless, and she could sense that their next move would be bolder, more personal. Elizabeth joined her, notebook in hand, curious and cautious. "Mother, do you think they'll try something drastic now?" Margaret glanced at her daughter, a soft smile touching her lips. "Drastic? Perhaps. But remember, Elizabeth, predictability is their weakness. They believe they can anticipate our reactions, yet they forget one thing. Preparation and principle cannot be undermined. Meanwhile, across town, Charles was pacing his office, frustration etched deeply into his features. His previous attempts had failed, every legal maneuver had been countered, every subtle influence neutralized. He rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath. "Victor," he said abruptly, turning to his partner, "we need a more aggressive approach. Subtlety and indirect pressure have failed. If we cannot manipulate or intimidate her legally, we must attack her confidence directly." Victor frowned. "Direct attack? You mean personal? That is dangerous, Charles. Margaret Whitmore is intelligent and meticulous. Any misstep could expose us instead of her." Charles's eyes hardened. "I don't care about risk anymore. We need results. If we must unsettle her personally, we will. Arrange for the neighbors to start questioning her character subtly. Spread rumors about debts, about her decisions regarding the property. Make it personal. If we chip away at her reputation, maybe, just maybe, she'll falter." Victor hesitated, uneasy about the moral and legal implications. "And if she sees through it? She won't just defend herself. She will counterattack. She may even use it to strengthen her position publicly. Are we ready for that?" Charles smirked. "Let her try. She cannot escape the reach of social doubt and scrutiny." Back at the Whitmore residence, Margaret had sensed a shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. Subtle whispers from neighbors, vague remarks about debts, and questioning of her judgment, all orchestrated carefully to appear casual. She listened quietly, noting each conversation, each tone, and each word. Nothing escaped her attention. That evening, Elizabeth asked cautiously, "Mother, are they trying to hurt you personally now?" Margaret's eyes met hers, calm but resolute. "Yes, Elizabeth. They hope that doubt and social pressure will weaken our resolve. But we will not falter. Observation, evidence, and preparation are more powerful than rumor and manipulation. Every whisper can become proof of their intent if we document it correctly." The next day, Margaret decided to act proactively. She drafted letters to the neighbors, clarifying misunderstandings politely but firmly, and requesting any formal concerns be addressed in writing. She also began organizing all previous interactions, legal documents, and observations into a meticulous binder, a comprehensive record of everything that could ever be used against her. In her study, Margaret reviewed the documents with Elizabeth. "See here," she said, pointing to a note from a neighbor. "They attempt to imply I am overstepping boundaries. But this note, alongside prior correspondence, proves the opposite. We maintain clarity, transparency, and documentation. That is how we protect ourselves." Elizabeth nodded. "I understand, Mother. It's like preparing for a battle without fighting physically." Margaret smiled. "Exactly. Elizabeth. Every move is a step in strategy. Emotional reaction can blind you. Evidence and logic illuminate the path." Across town, Charles and Victor had escalated further. They consulted a social strategist to amplify the subtle rumors and make them appear widespread. Every plan was layered. Small, seemingly innocent insinuations, combined with carefully timed gossip and pressure, aimed at creating a veneer of social doubt. Victor expressed concern. "Charles, are you sure this is wise? She has been meticulous so far. She may turn this against us publicly." Charles waved him off. "Let her. Even if she defends herself, we have shifted the environment. Social perception is powerful. We need to see if she can withstand not just legal scrutiny, but social pressure." Meanwhile, Margaret received another subtle signal. An unsigned note slipped under her door, hinting at neighbors losing trust and future consequences if actions continue. She did not react impulsively. Instead, she documented the note, photographed it, and stored it in her binder. Later that evening, Elizabeth asked, "Mother, don't you feel threatened by these attacks?" Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes reflecting wisdom and calm authority. "Elizabeth, fear is useless. Threats, whether legal, personal, or social, are only dangerous if you allow them to influence your decisions. We act from preparation, not from fear. Each attempt they make only strengthens our position when countered thoughtfully." The following morning, Margaret invited a few trusted neighbors over for tea. She spoke openly about the property, clarified misconceptions, and shared factual records in a non-confrontational manner. Her demeanor was composed, her tone respectful, yet firm. By the time the tea gathering ended, Margaret had not only reinforced her position, but also subtly restored any doubt the orchestrators had tried to implant. Charles learned of this development later that evening, and was visibly irritated. How does she always see through us? How does she maintain control even under social assault? Victor, quietly thoughtful, replied, because she prepares, Charles. Every detail is accounted for, every interaction recorded. She is not reacting blindly. She is guiding the narrative herself. Margaret, in the safety of her study, felt the satisfaction of controlled success. But she was aware that Charles and Victor would not relent. The escalation would continue, perhaps moving into new arenas. She prepared herself mentally for every eventuality, reinforcing her strategy, her evidence, and her patience. As night fell, Margaret sat on the front porch, Elizabeth beside her, both gazing at the illuminated house and quiet street. "Mother," Elizabeth whispered. "They tried to attack personally, socially, and even through the neighbors. How do you stay so calm?" Margaret smiled, lifting her teacup. "Because calmness is power. Elizabeth. Reaction is temporary. Preparation is lasting. They may escalate, but every escalation is a step we can anticipate. Every whisper, every rumor, every subtle intimidation is an opportunity for evidence. Strength is in patience and vigilance, not in force." Elizabeth leaned back, feeling the weight and wisdom of her mother's words. She understood that this was more than a battle over property. It was a lesson in resilience, strategy, and dignity. A blueprint for facing any challenge with intelligence and principle. And so, as the night deepened over the Whitmore residence, Margaret remained unshaken, anticipating the next wave of challenges. Charles and Victor might escalate, manipulate, and intimidate, but Margaret Whitmore had transformed her home into a fortress. Not just of bricks and wood, but of preparation, clarity, and unwavering principle. The following week began with an unusual tension in the Whitmore neighborhood. Margaret sensed it immediately, an almost tangible anticipation in the air, as though the entire block knew something was about to happen, even if they did not know the details. She moved through her home with calm efficiency, checking her files, reviewing past correspondences, and making notes on subtle behavioral patterns she had observed from Charles and Victor over the months. Elizabeth, increasingly aware of the stakes, walked alongside her mother. "Mother, they seem more desperate than before. Do you think they'll try something extreme now?" Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. Extreme or not, desperation is predictable. And predictability is an advantage. They will act rashly, perhaps recklessly. That is when we gain the upper hand. Patience, Elizabeth, is our most potent weapon. Across town, Charles could barely contain his frustration. The meticulous approach he had relied on, small legal maneuvers, social whispers, and subtle threats, had repeatedly failed. Margaret Whitmore had anticipated nearly every move, neutralizing them with grace, logic, and evidence. "We have to hit harder, Victor," Charles said, pacing in his office. "Margaret Whitmore is cornered only in the way we perceive her. She is untouchable because we continue to underestimate her intelligence. This time it cannot be subtle." Victor, ever cautious, raised an objection. "Charles, if we overreach, we risk exposure. Margaret is already prepared. One misstep, one overt act, and we lose not only the house but our reputation." Charles snapped, his patience fraying. "Enough. Subtlety has failed us. Now we take the direct route. If she thinks she can outmaneuver us forever, she's wrong. Arrange for the documents, the legal team, everything. This ends with confrontation." Meanwhile, Margaret received an anonymous letter that morning, placed carefully in her mailbox. Its contents were blatant and aggressive. A warning that Charles and Victor were initiating legal proceedings to claim ownership of the Whitmore residence immediately. The tone was threatening, but Margaret's response was measured. She documented everything meticulously, photographed the envelope, and stored it in her binder. Elizabeth read the letter with unease. "Mother, they're finally moving legally. Should we prepare to fight in court?" Margaret's gaze was steady, calm. "We have been preparing for this day, Elizabeth. Court is only another venue, another stage. Evidence, consistency, and principle are our allies. Emotion is their weapon. Reason is ours. The very next morning, Charles and Victor arrived at the Whitmore residence, accompanied by a team of lawyers and a clerk with documents requiring Margaret's signature. They believed the sight of legal authority and multiple witnesses would intimidate her into compliance. Margaret met them in the grand living room, serene and composed, her tea set nearby, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Good morning," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I understand you have documents to present. Please, leave them on the table. I shall review them shortly." Charles, trying to mask his frustration, stepped forward. "Margaret, this is serious. We need your signature to transfer ownership. It's a simple procedure, really." Margaret's smile widened ever so slightly. "Simple? Perhaps for those unprepared. But I prefer clarity before action. You see, I have anticipated this visit." She gestured toward a file on the table. "Everything you bring here is already documented, examined, and countered. Every claim you make, every suggestion you imply, is already addressed legally. Please proceed." The lawyers opened the documents, glancing nervously at Margaret. She had clearly reviewed every clause, every line. As Charles attempted to push for urgency, Margaret calmly placed a hand on one of the documents, pointing to a clause he had overlooked. "This section here is unenforceable without prior consent, as clearly indicated in the deeds dated 10 years ago. Your attempt to bypass this is not only invalid but legally void." Victor's face turned pale. "Charles, she has anticipated even this clause?" Margaret continued, her tone unwavering. "And there is more." She motioned toward a corner where Elizabeth had quietly placed a series of binders. "All communications, all notices, every attempt to manipulate or coerce, documented. I have evidence of intent, method, and repeated attempts to undermine rightful ownership. Every subtle whisper, every legal ploy, every personal intimidation attempt is recorded. Not only do I maintain ownership, but your actions may now expose you to legal consequences." Charles's jaw tightened, the frustration almost visible in the lines of his face. "Margaret, this is unnecessary. We could have settled." Margaret cut him off, her voice firm, resolute. "Settle? I have settled for 10 years already, providing my home freely, patiently, generously. You pushed boundaries, attempted manipulation, and tried to claim what is rightfully mine through deceit. This ends now, legally and decisively. There will be no settlement at my expense." The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that Margaret had prepared far beyond expectation. Every potential loophole, every hidden clause, every subtle attempt at coercion had been anticipated and neutralized. Charles and Victor had underestimated her once again, and for the final time. Margaret placed the final binder on the table, her hands steady. "I have notified the authorities of all these attempts. You may proceed with your paperwork if you wish, but know this. My home, my rights, and my dignity are protected. Any further attempts to undermine them will be met with legal action, and I am fully prepared to pursue it to its maximum extent." Silence filled the room. Elizabeth, standing beside her mother, felt a swell of pride and relief. Her mother had not only defended their home but had done so with strategy, intellect, and absolute composure. Charles finally spoke, his voice strained. "This is not over. You may have won this round, Margaret, but—" Margaret raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, Charles. This is over. You underestimated me, and you assumed generosity equates to weakness. It does not. I advise you to leave my property immediately, and to reconsider your approach to honesty and integrity in all future dealings." Defeated, Charles and Victor left, their entourage in tow. The Whitmore residence, once again, stood unchallenged, its ownership and dignity intact. Later that evening, Margaret and Elizabeth sat on the front porch, the cool evening breeze carrying a sense of finality. Margaret lifted her teacup and smiled, her eyes reflecting calm triumph. "Mother," Elizabeth said softly, you really did it. You protected everything without ever raising your voice, without ever compromising your principles." Margaret chuckled softly, the sound warm and triumphant. "Elizabeth, strength is not in force, but in foresight. Patience and preparation turn every attack into an opportunity. They thought they could take what was mine. They were wrong. And now, finally, we can rest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the Whitmore residence, Margaret's words hung in the air, a statement not only of victory but of lifelong wisdom. I never give away what is rightfully mine. And with that, the chapter of relentless attempts, manipulation, and intimidation closed. Her home and legacy safe, her principle unshaken, and her strength unchallenged. The morning sun spilled golden light over the Whitmore residence, illuminating the home that had withstood years of trials, manipulation, and challenge. Margaret moved through the halls with a quiet confidence, each step a reminder of the strength she carried within her. Elizabeth followed closely, a mixture of admiration and relief on her face. After the previous week's tense confrontation, a calm had finally settled over their lives, a calm hard-earned and deeply deserved. Margaret paused at the large window in the living room, gazing out at the meticulously kept garden. Birds flitted through the early bloom of spring flowers, their songs echoing softly in the crisp morning air. Elizabeth, Margaret began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of triumph. Sometimes the greatest victories are not loud. They are silent. They do not require applause. They require patience, foresight, and unwavering resolve. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. Mother, you showed me that strength isn't about anger or force. It's about knowing yourself, your rights, and never letting anyone take advantage of you. I've learned more from this than from anything else. Margaret smiled, a rare warmth lighting her face. Exactly, my dear. And never forget, principles are worth more than property, more than gold, more than any temporary comfort. I defended what was mine, yes, but I also defended justice, integrity, and dignity. Those are lessons that last a lifetime. Later that day, neighbors stopped by, some cautiously at first, others openly curious. They had all watched the unfolding events from a distance, hearing rumors of conflict, manipulation, and fierce resistance. Now, seeing Margaret composed, serene, and victorious, many expressed admiration. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Hargrove, approached Margaret hesitantly. Margaret, I don't know how you did it. I've never seen anyone handle such a situation with such grace. You've taught all of us a lesson. Margaret accepted the compliment with quiet humility. It was never about teaching others. It was about protecting what is rightfully ours, and ensuring the truth is upheld. Sometimes, life tests us not to punish, but to reveal our strength. Even Elizabeth noticed the subtle changes in the neighborhood, respectful glances, nods of acknowledgement, and smiles that had not been there before. It was as though Margaret's courage had reshaped the very atmosphere around her home, turning doubt and fear into respect. In the afternoon, Margaret took a seat on the front porch, the same spot where she had often pondered life, strategy, and the next steps. Elizabeth joined her, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of life in the streets, the laughter of children playing, and the occasional bark of a dog. Finally, Margaret spoke, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Elizabeth, do you know why I never let them intimidate me? It is because fear is temporary, but pride in one's principles lasts forever. I was generous, and I trusted, but never blindly. And that trust, tempered with caution, protected us. Always remember that. Elizabeth took a sip of her tea, her mind absorbing every word. Mother, I think I understand now. You weren't just defending a house. You were defending everything we stand for. You've shown me how to stand firm, even when the world seems to turn against us. Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. And that is the legacy I hope to leave, Elizabeth. Not just a house, but courage, wisdom, and the understanding that one must never compromise their dignity for convenience or fear. As the day waned, the sun casting long shadows across the Whitmore lawn, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation. She let the warmth of the sun and the comfort of home sink in, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. For years, she had faced challenges, manipulated situations, and stood alone at times. Yet now, victory was hers, not through force, not through anger, but through steadfast resolve, intelligence, and careful planning. In the late evening, as the sky blushed with hues of orange and purple, Margaret and Elizabeth walked through the home, checking each room, sharing memories, and laughing softly at little recollections from the past. The house, which had once been a source of potential conflict, now felt like a sanctuary, a symbol of resilience and love. Margaret paused at the front porch again, lifting her teacup in a quiet toast to the setting sun. To home, to truth, and to standing firm. Apna liya hua hak, jishi ko nahi dedi. She chuckled softly, the sound mingling with the evening breeze, carrying a mixture of triumph, relief, and wisdom. Elizabeth leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, and Margaret wrapped an arm around her daughter. In that moment, the Whitmore residence was more than a home. It was a testament to courage, patience, and unyielding integrity. Margaret's journey had concluded, not with vengeance or destruction, but with dignity, pride, and a legacy that would last generations. The quiet strength of Margaret Whitmore had proven itself, and the world around her had no choice but to acknowledge it. And as night fell, the lights of the home glimmered softly, a beacon of endurance, justice, and the invincible power of a woman who knew her worth and defended it without compromise.